Thank you. If you guys don't mind, I will stand and do this panel because I just find it easier to reference to my notes. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to be back at WBS 2019 in Singapore. And we heard two very passionate presentations in the morning from my friends Nathan and Alex. Both of them spoke pretty articulately about politics, right? So rest assured, it's not going to be three. I'm not going to talk about politics. Although you somehow can't seem to get away from any blockchain conference without talking about ideologies and politics and libertarianism, et cetera, et cetera. So those two gentlemen have covered that. We will zoom from politics to policies. Let's try and make it real on what's happening on ground, et cetera. And before I start this panel, there are four fabulous panelists here. Some of them my dear friends I've known for quite a long time. I just want to give you a little bit of flavor and context of why we are discussing it. Some of you probably were here last year as well, and I had the pleasure of moderating this very same panel last year with a similar bunch of leaders from Access, from SFA, et cetera. And this was what, June 2018, different times, completely different times, right? We were still deliberating about the ideology and politics and whether we even need regulations in this ecosystem or not. Crypto winter, the sentiments were very different. And self-regulatory organizations were just beginning to take roots, not just in Singapore, but across Asia. And in just 1 year, we've come such a long way, right? So I'm going to try and do some bit of compare and contrast of what's happened in this ecosystem in this last 1 year. And to help me along this journey, it's my pleasure to have four fabulous panelists. Two of them have flown in from Hong Kong. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our fabulous panelists, and I would request them to do a quick 30-second introduction. We can start with you, Simon.
Sure. Well, I work with OriginX Capital. We are an accelerator in the blockchain space. So the company was set up and started investing in emerging blockchain businesses. Core team is based off of a group of senior lawyers, and what's happened over time is that we started acting as in-house counsel for some of the businesses that we were helping to grow up, and that has kind of evolved into an advisory arm as well. So that's kind of what we do. I'm personally a little bit more on the asset management side, so the way that I come at this is in particular helping people who have maybe had success in investments in blockchain, and then they decide that they want to start managing other people's money. So how can they go about setting up a small firm to start managing a fund? That would be the kind of people I'd be working with at the moment.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christy. I'm from Hong Kong. Actually, I'm Texas via London to Hong Kong, where I've been for 23 years. So I consider myself to be representing and flying the Hong Kong flag here. I am Hong Kong qualified lawyer first, and then UK qualified. But I am American. So I guess my perspective on this is from the fact that we've been in this space for about 8 years. And I've set up recently my own law firm, so I understand kind of the trials and tribulations of setting up and being a startup in this space as well, having just been in the, I guess, for about 7 months now, been in the startup phase ourselves with our law firm. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to kind of, like I said, be flying the Hong Kong flag.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Frederick. I'm actually with Access. My background is in economics. I'm not a lawyer, so don't take anything I say as legal advice. We at Access, we work with the industry in Singapore and work very closely with the regulators and the Association of Banks in Singapore.
Morning, everyone. Branson. I'm with the Singapore FinTech Association since its inception. I'm also with the Token Economy Association, also another association set up to actually self-regulate the token issuance. I'm also the founder for 2 blockchain startups, so very happy to be here.
Wonderful. Doesn't get better than this, right? 2 lawyers, economist, blockchain entrepreneur, fintech mentor, and ex-banker. So for those who don't like the term banker, please pardon me. That was in my 1.0 avatar. Alex, of course, spoke pretty passionately against disrupting or against that ecosystem and to disrupt it. So let's try and pick the brains of our experts here. And I'm going to throw open this first question to all of you so that we can get perspectives from different jurisdictions and not just Hong Kong, but even mainland. as I mentioned, we've come a long way in the past 1 year. Now the debate is not on whether we need regulations or not, or whether a decentralized ecosystem should be regulated. It's about what kind of regulations do we need so that the ecosystem gets deepened, becomes more mature, et cetera. And we've seen fewer and fewer instances of exchange hacks, Ponzi schemes, et cetera also. So there's clearly a move away from the dodgy players to more serious players in the ecosystem. My question to each of you is, please share one or two interesting or important regulations or regulatory interventions that you might have seen in the last 1 year or so, which you believe has gone a long way in deepening and shaping this ecosystem. Could be from your jurisdictions, could be studies or from other jurisdictions that you've benchmarked. Even one is fine, but share something that you personally feel has been important to the ecosystem and why. And this time we'll start with you, Branson.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to say is not new. I think this has been a perennial problem for a lot of, token issuers and things like that. I think it's the issue of KYC AML, right? So I think this is by far one of the most, talked about issue. But we have begun to see a lot more clarity, at least from the Singapore standpoint, that regardless of how you issue the tokens or whether you are issuing a utility token or security token, doesn't matter, but you need to comply with the AML KYC policies. I think that's a very, very important factor because, as we have seen in 2017, it's just, wild, wild west, right? So I think that's a very, very good step towards the so-called mainstream adoption. Because without that, I think, we are nowhere near the so-called, if you have seen Alex's presentation just now, we are nowhere near the mainstream adoption without that, yeah.
Thank you. And that's a very important point, to articulate. For right or wrong reasons, this ecosystem has acquired some bad actors and therefore some bad name in terms of regulators, at least in the early days, having this point of view that cryptocurrencies are used for the dark web and things which are not savory. Although probably studies have shown that the facts are otherwise, and there's more money being laundered in the mainstream banking system than with tokens, etc. But it's an important step, in terms of giving this ecosystem the status of an industry and making it more mature. So thanks for bringing that out, Branson. Frederick?
So I think I would like to talk about something that Access has been working on in Singapore, which is the standardization of practices in crypto entities, SPICE. What we've done is that we've engaged with the regulators, MAS in Singapore, as well as the Association of Banks in Singapore. And we've gathered industry players in Singapore as well to come together and bring up our practices regarding compliance to tackle AML CFT concerns. And this also came from FATF guidelines that was issued, especially the travel rule, which is the number 15. And this right now is the industry needs to solve this problem together. And we see this as a needle coming towards us. It's more like whether or not the industry can band together and the industry can cooperate with each other to make sure that we actually prevail from this.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take a little bit higher, 40,000-foot view of this. Coming from the U.S. originally, but having been in Hong Kong for 23 years, Hong Kong's a very much East meets West type of place. We pretty much like the laissez-faire environment of the government. Don't bother us, we won't bother you. I think this is the first time in my experience and counseling our clients that people come to me and say, Christy, we want to be regulated. We want to know what regulators are thinking. We want to understand where this is all going. And that, to me, is quite surprising. But in context of, I guess, where we're going with crypto, where we're trying to get with blockchain, I do think that probably it's a positive step. Now, I won't make any comments as to possibly who might be or should be the ones regulating this space. But I think everyone's looking for some guidance, and I think that was very evident and very clear last week when David Marcus was giving evidence to the Senate hearing. committee about where the Facebook Libra was trying to go or is trying to go and what the kind of pushback was. So I think it's not just a Hong Kong aspect or perhaps even a Singapore aspect. I do totally agree with Frederick, though, that AML KYC must be a part of the process. It must be part of the blockchain. It must be part of the onboarding, offboarding. So I think there's a lot of things, and I would also include that probably data protection must come as a very close second. AML, KYC, counter-tariff financing aspects are very important, but I think data protection, privacy, Facebook was just fined $5 billion overnight, so I think by the FTC. So I think this is all becoming very, very much a very regulated space, and I think it's actually being welcomed by the community, which is a bit of a surprise, I must say, for myself.
Agree with all of what's been said. I think AML obviously is a recurring theme, and given the Financial Action Task Force recent announcements, I'm sure that's something that we'll be talking about more. Maybe just to give another specific example of regulators focusing on AML, in the Cayman Islands at the moment, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority has asked all of the excluded persons who are investment managers who are a little way short of being fully licensed. They've had to submit, or they're having to submit at the moment, copies of all of their AML policies and so on, and all of that is going to be closely examined. And in terms of what is happening for investment managers in the Cayman Islands, and this affects a lot of people who are setting up crypto funds over there at the moment, there's a new category of registered person being introduced for investment managers, and there's more of an emphasis there on AML compliance, so the authorities are looking at it very closely.
Thank you. So no surprises there. The consistent theme is AML, KYC, CFT, and Christy, you also mentioned about data privacy, so thank you for that. All of these are very, very pertinent points, and if this has to become a mature industry, all of these will have to be complied to without deviation, without exception. I'm going to go slightly deeper into this, and this is a question I remember I had tabled last year as well, so it's still an unresolved question if I have to discuss it this year. And I'm going to, again, leave it open, but I'll start with you, Christy. Given that there is still this kind of ambiguity on whether a token should or needs to be classified as a payment instrument, as an asset class, as a utility token, somewhere in the middle, or a new category altogether, share some examples or best practices in your view of which entities are the most suitable to regulate this ecosystem. And we've seen this right from the US, where between Fed and SEC to many, many parts of Asia, I have seen many, many different models at work. But before I share my perspectives, I would love to hear from the panelists on why do you believe a certain agency should be like the primary nodal agency for, not just regulating this ecosystem, but also being the primary custodian of this ecosystem, and why would you say so? And after Christy, I would leave the floor open.
Thanks for the question. I actually think in Hong Kong, I'll take it from a Hong Kong perspective first. Let's take a look at the ICO days. And we were always trying to argue, oh, it's a utility token. But was it really? Sometimes I would say, right, it totally is a utility token. Sometimes you're going, wow, right, it was before the discussion and talks about security tokens coming on board. In my view, from a Hong Kong perspective, it needs to be the Securities and Futures Commission. When you look at crypto, if you were buying and selling crypto, it's no different than if you were basically doing execution-only shares, sales, et cetera. So from my perspective, that would lean nicely. Now, when we have argued, now I'll be honest, we've been in front of the SFC and tried to argue that point because some of my clients who were type 1 licensed persons wanted to actually started offering crypto in their offerings and their product offerings. We met with the SFC and they said, no, thank you, no way, not under my roof, not in my house, thank you. So I think there is a bit of a reluctance to basically have some of the regulators take on some of the responsibilities in the crypto space, because let's be honest, it's a hard one. There's a lot of questions and a lot of moving parts. We can all sit up here and talk about what we think Libra is or isn't, and I think we would probably all come up with differing views, perhaps a few overlaps in the same. So I think from a regulator's point of view, it's a very hard space to try to figure out who wants to take ownership and responsibility. Also because you have to skill up. Luckily, I can say in the last probably 2 years in Hong Kong, I do feel our regulators have skilled up immensely, and I think they're tackling a lot of the charges and things that they're seeing, but it's a new space, and it's very hard from a regulator's point of view because you're basically trying to predict the future, which, as I always say from a legal point of view, is that we're always reactionary, and we like being that way because it's a very safe place to be.
Thank you. Branson, Frederick, Simon.
Yeah, so just to add on, I think in terms of some of these developments, I totally concur that technology has moved very, very fast, especially in the crypto space. So the regulators themselves are basically trying to keep up. And in Singapore's respect, I think it has been a pretty, I would say, according to the managing director of MES, the regulations need to run alongside innovation and not ahead of innovation. I think that's a brilliant statement from him because if you regulate the space too much or too soon, it will stifle a lot of all this innovation. So in that respect, I think recently the Singapore Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore, IRAS, basically came out with a draft proposal that going forward, if you use tokens as payment, as a form of payment, and there are certain classifications under that, definitions, it will be GST exempt. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is that if you are doing issuance of tokens, doing ICOs and things like that, that also can be considered GST exempt. And all these are draft, basically. But I think that's a good step, right? Basically, it's telling the community that, you know what, go ahead and do your thing. But at the end of the day, just know that we are keeping an eye on you. So I think it's a good move, yeah.
Thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I have seen this reasonably closely, and credit to Access and the team involved with this, in engaging very closely with IRAS. What you are seeing is the outcome, but there was a lot of work which went in the background, a lot of engagement, and a lot of explanation on why certain tokens should be construed as forms of payment and therefore should be exempt from GST. I don't know if something like this is already being discussed or is being evaluated in other jurisdictions. But as promised, I will skip the taxation part of it because that might be a bit boring for our audience. But anything else on this theme that any of you may want to share before I proceed?
I was just going to add, I mean, that's a very important point that Branson makes because we had several offshore jurisdictions come to us and say, oh, Christy, we've now got our ICO legislation and regulations in place now. And I said, oh, that's great, I suppose, because at least from a Hong Kong perspective, we don't see ICOs being the new trend, actually, the way forward. So sometimes when you have governments or regulators work on something which, as technology, as Branson said, technology passes you by, your legislation somewhat gets caught up in the doldrums and doesn't quite make it out of the fence in time for your technology, and in fact, technology eclipses it. So I think sometimes when people start to maybe complain that the regulators haven't done enough or there isn't enough in circulation as to what they may be thinking, I think the problem is that sometimes that they can be thinking about things, trying to be very prudent about it, but the technology just quite frankly passes it by. So I think that is a very brilliant comment to say that you can't basically try to sit around and think about what legislation needs to be in place and then wait for the technology to catch up, because we know that's never going to be the case.
Thank you. And before we go to the next topic, if I may add a couple of my perspectives and my 2 cents. I have been fortunate in the last 24 months to engage quite closely with many regulators across the region and even in Africa. 2 examples stand out for me, and these are not the only 2, but these are the ones which I found interesting for a variety of reasons. One is in Vietnam, and I have gone and spoken there quite a few times and engaged with State Bank of Vietnam and SEC, etc. So they have come up with this model where they have created a nodal agency in the law ministry, which kind of then coordinates the interdepartmental or intergovernmental agencies, but all the front ending is done by the law ministry. So I found that quite interesting, and I was discussing with them on why the law ministry and why not the central bank or Securities Commission, etc. And they said, a lot of this deals within the jurisdiction of legislation and framing, etc. Therefore, the law ministry and the lawyers could probably concur or disagree with that, but this was an interesting model. And the other was Bank of Thailand. In fact, I was just in Thailand last week. I was speaking there at a Bank of Thailand conference. And they actually came up with a blockchain framework back in early 2018, which I thought was quite progressive for an ASEAN regulator a year and a half back to come up with a framework which was fairly comprehensive and fairly robust, not ambiguous, but clearly outlining different tokens in different buckets and also token versus non-token led initiatives. So these are two examples that have kind of, I found it quite interesting and could form good benchmarking studies as well. Before we go ahead, I just want to spend a couple of minutes, Frederick. Access was quite involved in the recent V20. Most of you may be aware that we had the G20 discussions recently in Japan, and as part of that, a working group called the V20 was set up, which was basically for the virtual asset providers, in which Access was one of the leading entities. Could you share maybe top 3 outcomes or highlights of those discussions, and in the context of the discussions with FATF, what were the top 2 or 3 outcomes of that discussion?
So just to give a little bit of context, when Access went to Vienna to participate in the FATF public consultation for the crypto space, they gave some recommendations that we felt as a community was quite onerous. That being said, our response to it was V20. And V20, what we did was we gathered some regulators around the world. We also gathered the big industry players and some of the compliance people, so Merkle Science, and we get them all together and we brainstorm ideas on how we can still comply with those rules, but still maintain the decentralized aspect of the blockchain space. Because what we don't want to have is too centralized, because that goes against what this industry means. So what we really want to see for the outcome for V20, one of the biggest one is community engagement. So regulators, they don't like to engage 1,000 blockchain companies at the same time. They always want to talk to one association or a group of associations. So with that, so to engage the members through them. So over here, out of V20, IDEXA was formed. And this is basically an association of associations. So Access Singapore is part of it. We also have the Hong Kong Blockchain Association, the Australian Blockchain Association, the Japanese, and many, many more. And we're continuing to grow in that aspect as well, so that we can also engage the international community on an international level. And this was also one of the biggest outcomes. So basically, and the second one is basically Trevor 15, where VASP, Virtual Asset Service Provider, have to share information. Now, today, there is very little solutions that we have seen so far that can actually comply with this particular rule. The US claims to have one, and the Japanese claims to work with SWIFT to do this. But we also see that, when, let's say, 2 exchanges, when they send from crypto from one to the other, they need to send this information as well. And there is no open framework yet. And we're constantly working together with the community as well, with our industry members, and to formulate these solutions. And I think basically these 2 words are really important, and it comes close to my heart, is that we need to engage the community. We need to engage the industry, because the solutions come from there. And we need to work as an industry with the regulators, and so that we can agree on some things. And that is the biggest outcome that came from it.
Thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned that. How many of you here are not from Singapore? Okay. In case you're wondering why WBS is held in Singapore, this is one of the reasons. It always takes a leading and proactive position in the ecosystem, and it's not just MAS and the regulators, but even the industry bodies like Access. So, a round of applause for them. Come on, some energy.
Thank you.
Okay. You've mentioned an important point, and I want to touch upon this a little more with both you and Branson. One of the things which was discussed actively at the panel last year was the role of SROs, self-regulatory organizations, and industry bodies like Access, SFA is, of course, there, and now you have T. Interesting name. I was thinking of a similar acronym for coffee, which I'll discuss with you offline. But T stands for what? Token Economy Association, right? And then, of course, there was also GITA, which was set up, the Global ICO Transparency Alliance or organization. Tell us, in the last 1 year, how has the role of the SROs evolved very quickly? And for the next 1 year, what would be your top 1 or 2 priorities as industry associations, as SROs? And perhaps, Branson, you can take that to start with.
Yeah, I think it has been very fruitful so far. I think, as I've mentioned, the Singapore government has been very, very supportive. I think they, as much as they know that this blockchain thing is all the hype, but it's getting real, right? Because there are more and more people coming on board, and therefore they're very willing to actually listen to industry partners like ours, as well as Access as well. So I think it's good for the future because no one knows everything, right? At the end of the day, especially with technology moving so fast. So the fact that they are willing to work alongside industry partners. In fact, we have a chief fintech officer as well. So that itself says a lot. So I think going forward, what the Singapore Fintech Association can do, together with some other industry partners, is to continually engage the regulators and, maybe just to not even educate, but maybe to, cross-reference with each other. Like, okay, this is what's happening amongst all our startup members. Do you see such things happening? And I think one of the sticking points is probably, I think Frederick will agree to this, is the bank accounts, right? A lot of the startups are especially in blockchain space, are facing difficulties in getting bank accounts. I think that's one of the sticking points that potentially we can help to resolve as well. Yeah.
Just to add on, so Access Singapore and T, we actually already have an MOU in place. We want to work together, and we have been working together. And a lot of the events that we've done it with SFA, we've done it with T. So Singapore, we have something called the Payment Services Act that was passed earlier this year. And so what we've done is also next month on the 14th of August, Singapore Fintech Association and Access Singapore has an event. Now this event is actually for the community to come to us, and then after that we actually engaged our friendly legal partners, Linklaters. We love to use them. And so they actually will come as well to introduce and give the community talks about how this affects the industry. But we've done one better as well. MES will be attending the event as a speaker. And at the same time, they'll be placed on a hot seat and basically the community will basically also ask them questions regarding the Payment Services Act. And we've been working very closely with this, and we've been engaging the community, and we want more to come. And that's what we've been actively trying to do for the space in Singapore. And so basically, if you ever are in Singapore, join us as members, Singapore or us.
Thank you. You guys are all welcome to join in. It should be a good session. It's on 14th of August, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Christy and Simon, the clock is ticking, and I cannot complete this conversation without the elephant in the room, Facebook Libra, right? As far as I can remember, in my 20 years of career, or at least in the last 5 years in the blockchain ecosystem, I can't think of any other corporate announcement which has probably generated this kind of buzz and curiosity in the ecosystem, not just with the industry players and the ecosystem, but also with regulators around the world. And we were chatting earlier over coffee. I was in Bangkok last week, so the Bank of Thailand says they are engaging or they plan to engage further with Facebook for Libra. On the same stage, we had the deputy governor of the Central Bank of Cambodia saying unequivocally that she will not allow Libra to enter Cambodia for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into now. We've obviously seen the US Congressional Committee saying very, very categorically, stop, without any further delay, unless you get approvals and unless you engage us, don't go about it this way. MAS has said that they are watching this space very closely. So it's one of those very measured reactions from MAS. tell us from your perspective, what do you see as the big opportunity and the big challenge for Libra, and what does it mean for the larger ecosystem? We'll start with the two lawyers here, and then the two other gents are free to chime in. Christy, you're in the hot seat. You're the only lady on the panel, so it comes to you.
Right. I think actually the interesting, so opportunities and challenges. I think the opportunity is, it's a great opportunity for all of us because quite frankly, they're going to have to work through some really difficult decisions and kind of try to figure out, are they an animal, vegetable, or mineral? I'm not too sure after watching 2.5 hours of the Senate committee hearing whether Libra, Cala Libra, whether they actually know what they are either. They mentioned that they're a payment-like, so we all discussed earlier, maybe that's more heading on the, I'm more like money than not, of which, even in Hong Kong, that would come under our Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and the monetary policy would apply. On my kind of analysis and reading through their very thin white paper, I suggest maybe it's a utility token. So I think the challenges here is, what is it, what will it really do? I think the other aspect, of course, the elephant is not so, well, it's an obvious one, is that the governments basically, initially some, came out very quickly to say, we're not going to allow it, we don't like it, etc. I think from a Hong Kong perspective, when we look at this, they always say, if the US does X, we will always consider what they're doing as a possible way forward. But I think this is also showing that Switzerland is also perhaps putting itself on the map a bit, because they're showing some fairly, I think, creative and very interesting thoughts as to how you can regulate this type of activity. So I think, the challenge is going to be whether or not they can get through, because I don't think really they thought they were going to meet as much hesitation and or outright, confirmation that people won't be accepting it from that they did. But what it means for the rest of us is that the three things that I think we've talked about a lot on this panel, that being, AML, KYC, terrorist financing, and data privacy issues will really need to be thought through, because those are the areas which were very much, very critically looked into during these hearings. So I think, for me, it's a fantastic opportunity, I think, for Libra, and I think it shows that this is the way forward. I don't know if it's an if or when scenario, but I do think it's a very exciting time for the ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you. Simon?
So it's going to be very interesting to see how they will be able to construct something that can work in multiple jurisdictions. And I think the issues around geo-blocking, the use of technology to restrict access to the website or to certain services, whether that's going to be sufficient is an interesting question, because of course we all know that you can use VPN to get around this. And of course that's one of the many benefits of using cryptocurrency for many people who are looking at situations where they're maybe living in a state which is very restrictive in terms of currency movements. The ability to use crypto for them is a key to getting around those restrictions. I'm not sure quite what the answer to that is. I'm just sort of pointing to the challenge, really, and we will have to see how governments react to that and what they're able to really do, whether they can actually effectively regulate this or not.
Thank you. And before I go to these two gents, I want to do a quick straw poll in the audience. Assuming, and let's kind of run with some assumptions, assuming that the regulators okay Libra in most of the jurisdictions here, etc., and considering that all of us have Facebook and probably use it once a day or more frequently, how many of us in a year's time would actually be comfortable or want to use Libra for payments? Not even as our primary payments, but just for some sort of payment. Please raise your hands. So about half or less than half. The others are ambivalent, or they would not still feel comfortable using Facebook for payments. Okay. So at least there is openness. My question to both of you is, do you see this as one of those big pushes that the ecosystem needed to mainstream it, considering the response of the audience here?
Yeah, I think this Facebook Libra thing is obviously very good for the industry. I think just to continue on Christy's point is that I think it's not so much of, on one hand, obviously the regulators are right in the sense that they should be sort of concerned to a certain extent, but But then again, if you look at the Libra token, essentially it's actually pegged against a basket of sovereign currencies. So I don't think there's a major concern that it will replace the US dollar or things like that, because it's a closed loop system, right? Essentially, you use Libra to actually pay for, I don't know, Facebook apps or whatever. So that's one point. But on the other hand, I guess, it's also an opportunity for us to actually, dip our toes into the cryptocurrencies, and it's only good for the industry as a whole. Yeah.
So, before we go to Frederick, you mentioned something important in terms of a closed loop system. Let me ask you this: in your perspective, do you see this as a stable coin? And you also said it's pegged to a bunch of currencies, fiat currencies. Is it a payment railroad? Is it something that will eventually, in the not so distant future, significantly damage, if not replace, banks? Where do you see Libra fitting in? Or all of the above, some of the above, none of the above, don't know?
Well, I would say that as of now, if you have read the white paper, it seems like a payment token. It seems like, right? I think the more important
Which is
question,
where you're already disagreeing with Christy, right? She sees it more as a utility.
I think the more important question is, what are we giving up if we use the payment token or Libra? I think that's the more important question. Are we giving up a lot more than we think we are already giving up? Or I would say, think along the lines of data privacy and our personal data. I think that's the most important question that we should ask ourselves. It's not so much of whether it's a utility token or a payment token. Yeah.
Very valid point. In fact, one of the concerns of many regulators is not just the fact that Facebook is so large and it's getting into the money space, but it's also its past history in terms of data privacy security. And you must have read only recently, there was a $5 billion fine, right? So not the most credible organization when it comes to managing and safeguarding data. Frederick?
Well, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Is Libra the product or are we the product? But I've been privileged to live in Singapore, and we're overbanked. And we want to support the idea of financial inclusion. That's why we're really excited about Libra, because it brings financial inclusion to the underbanked as well. The potential is great, but the risk is real. And this is something that we see every day. And we need to take a more risk-based approach, a more holistic way of looking at things. And because the technology is evolving so fast, we need to also band together to say, okay, let's keep up with it and understand what it does, what it is. Until today, I don't think, because of such large difference of opinions, we still haven't really pinpointed on that. And I think that's where we can really focus on, is that when we start to take a risk-based approach on Libra, and if they actually do what they say the technical and the white paper set out to do, and if they achieve that financial inclusion, I think it's great. It will bring a lot of interest into crypto. But if they abuse that power, then the regulators will definitely would be more stricter on that front, because we definitely don't want bad things to happen. We want more good actors in the space, not bad actors.
Thank you. Articulated very philosophically. And indeed, so much of this discussion in the ecosystem, even today, is about the philosophy and the ideology of what constitutes money or what constitutes a transaction. So that's a discussion for another time. But you mentioned a very important point, and thanks for that. You spoke about financial inclusion, and in fact, okay, so we have 2 more minutes. Thank you. My interaction with several regulators, the only reason or the primary reason why quite a few of them are open-minded about this is because of this opportunity to drive financial inclusion. And I would have actually loved to press on. The jury is out on whether it can actually achieve that goal while Facebook is used by 2 billion people and everybody in every emerging market uses Facebook. Till they achieve the last mile, how is the cash in, cash out to fiat going to happen? And as Branson said, unless it becomes a truly closed loop system, which I don't foresee it happening, people using Libra for everything. People have not used Bitcoin to pay for their coffee. I can't foresee Libra happening. So the last mile in terms of cash in and cash out to multiple fiats has to happen before it can become a vehicle for financial inclusion. So probably noble intentions aside, there is a lot of grassroots work which will have to be put in. The jury is out whether a digital company or a fully digital company like Facebook has it in their genes to get into the last mile distribution, but that discussion for probably my next panel. We are almost out of time. We have time for one audience question, if at all. Anybody? Yes, please. Kindly introduce yourself and whom is this question directed to?
Name is Roger Collantes. My question, actually, it's a comment. I believe the millennials are really going to go into the Libra project because I read a survey that 30% of 18 to 24 years old believe in Libra, and about 19% of those 25 to 29 believe and will put the money there. So that means sometimes we're missing out this millennial that will actually be part of this new community that we're trying to build. And very often, the fear is bigger than actually the benefit. I mean, the way it's being discussed now, it's like scary because it's Facebook, but let's face it, it's got its own community that believes in it, and I think we got to reckon with that. That's all I want to say, that I believe Libra is going to fly. I'm betting on it.
Thank you for that articulation, and that's probably the reason why so many banks are shit scared of Libra, because there is a large bunch of younger people for whom the concept of money is very different from at least our generation. I don't know about these two gentlemen. And banks don't need to be in the picture. With that, we come to the end of time. I would have loved to carry on, but time's up. Please put your hands together for my four wonderful panelists. Thank you.